All right. Well, welcome everyone. This is the final public presentation for the Shoreline Revitalization and Community Connectivity Improvements Project. My name is Kim Lucas. I'm with HCR Engineering, and with me today, also from HCR, we have Barbara Barnes, Ann Salmon, and Dave Davis. We will have a couple folks on the call for the live presentation, but this will be recorded and we'll make it available for those who wish to view this at a later date. So next slide. Just a couple quick items for using Zoom. All of our attendees will remain on mute for the presentation, but if you want to ask any questions throughout the presentation, feel free to type them in by clicking the Q&A button at the bottom, and we'll review any questions and give some answers at the end of the presentation. Next slide. So just a quick overview of what our agenda includes for this presentation. We'll cover the objectives for today, an overview of the project so far. We'll also talk about all the different community engagement activities that we've had for this project. And then we'll walk through some of the elements for the final conceptual design. We'll also talk about our permitting assessment and the meeting that we had with New York State DEC. We'll cover some key items from our cost opinion, and then we'll summarize what the next steps are for this project. Next slide. All right. So the meeting objectives for today are to review the climate adaptive design phase 2 process. And phase 2 is the phase that we're currently wrapping up as part of this meeting. And then Barbara will walk us through some of the proposed preliminary design elements, and then we'll cover next steps for the project and different ways to help move this forward in terms of funding opportunities. Next slide. All right, some background on the project. So we've probably all heard about climate change and sea level rise, and Ossining, along with a bunch of other waterfront communities, are at risk for being impacted by this. So some of the first activities that we performed as part of the phase 2 of the climate adaptive design program was to engage the community as a continuation of phase 1, which Dan will cover a little bit later in this presentation, and identify different ways to make the Ossining shoreline more resilient in a way that the community wants. We also conducted a site assessment by physically walking throughout the waterfront area and identifying potential constraints as well as opportunities for different resilient features. Just want to note that this project focused on publicly owned parcels, so that for Ossining is primarily the Henry Gordine Park and the Lewis Endel Park. We also received lots of input and feedback from key stakeholders within the community and made sure that what we were proposing aligned with other ongoing park improvement projects, including some of the initiatives from the Downtown Revitalization Initiative Grant. And there are a couple other projects that are ongoing within Ossining right now. Next slide, please. So the primary design objectives for the phase 2 program is that we propose a project that is not only cost effective, but able to be permitted through the state and other federal agencies, just so that it's a tangible project that can see its way through design and construction. We also made sure that the project aligns with Ossining's comprehensive plan and the local waterfront revitalization plan. So this project focused on different aspects of coastal resiliency and the ability for the project to be adapted as the climate changes. And we also have educational and interpretive elements throughout the project, which Barbara will cover a little bit more. And last but not least, this project will serve as a model for diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice. Next slide, please. So I'm going to turn it over to Dan now to talk about some of our community engagement activities for phase 2.
Yeah, thank you, Kim. So with any project, a big piece is making sure that the community that ultimately the project is going to be built for is involved and that it's something that they're going to be able to use in the future. So as part of this design, community engagement was a big feature. We did multiple engagement opportunities, and every time we had any opportunity out there, we prioritized making sure that we were connecting with underserved communities to promote equitable engagement and partnering with different community organizations to provide translated materials and prioritizing accessibility as well as part of this project. So with most things though, there was the phase 1, like Kim said. So CAD phase 1 had a solid piece of community engagement, which was start out with a site visit, same deal, looking around the site, hosting a community workshop, getting some input, refining their design based on that community feedback, and then sharing that final design with the community in shareholders meeting. So we built upon that and took that into consideration as we worked through in phase 2. So to kind of take you through our general timeline for phase 2 engagement, our first item was a pop-up event at Green Ostening's Earth Day, where we had a survey to hear the community's different priorities for the shoreline. In that particular event, we spoke to about 30 residents, received around 40 responses to the digital survey, and it was a great day out. It was a beautiful day. It was great seeing the kids walking over the bridge and getting a chance to hear what people really love to see on the waterfront and what they use it for. From that particular event, we took the feedback to start developing different design elements, which we then shared at this stakeholder workshop. You can see the photo down on the bottom, which was geared towards community-led organizations and stakeholders directly impacted by the shoreline. And then from the stakeholder workshop, we took that feedback, tried to finalize several different items, and then we invited public feedback through a virtual open house, which was available in Spanish and English. And this virtual open house included an interactive conceptual map and with different descriptions of what the climate adaptive design elements were. Oh boy, excuse me there, this thing, technical difficulties. Me and PowerPoint don't always get along. So, but following the workshop, we invited public feedback. And then the last community engagement was a community meeting where we presented the draft design map and which showed all the compiled feedback received to date. And with that, Barbara, I kind of jumped ahead a little bit there, but I'm going to pass the baton to talk about the final conceptual design.
Perfect, thank you. Yeah, so we kind of took all of that information, various feedback, and came up with a concept design that we kind of consider a kit of parts, if you will. Any piece of this could be a little bit independent. However, the in-water work does need to be thought of together in some sense. So when you look at permitting, which is always a part of waterfront work, there's no net increase of fill is what you're aiming for. You don't want to have to do off-site mitigation to kind of extend your fill opportunities. So what we looked at, and you can go to the first slide, is that was one of the primary considerations. So we looked at sheet pile wall for the main reason, and Dan, some reason, there you go. So along the shoreline in different areas, the main reason was actually because sheet pile is very vertical, and so we could eliminate some of the riprap toe and gain a fill area to offset some of the fill that we're suggesting. So that's the reason that we suggested sheet pile wall. The other options would be to either cut into the park, so reduce kind of the land area of the park to offset that fill, or increase the slope of the riprap itself. But the sheet pile does offer some opportunities. It could be actually elevated later on and designed to be raised. So it would offer flood protection, assuming that you could tie it back into upland. And then that would need pump stations and all the other stuff, but it could be elevated to provide flood protection in the future. It also can offer habitat. So there are ways to actually attach concrete kind of panels to the front of it. This isn't tested in the Hudson, so you'd probably want to do a pilot program. but there is a section of sheet pile wall on the adjacent southern property. So maybe an opportunity, if this was an interest, to do a pilot program over there to see how this works in the Hudson. The image on the bottom is actually Seattle. They did a whole pilot program and it's been working really well for them. So we know it's been tested, just not on the East Coast, unfortunately. So that's kind of the big piece of this, is how do you deal with your shoreline and what opportunities can you create without really impacting the park itself, because it is a very narrow piece of property and we didn't want to cut into that shoreline because we know it would be problematic. So there's limited space as it is. So you can go to the next slide. Perfect. So the boardwalks were another piece that were very, very popular. There's 3 of them shown. One of them could be explored. You could explore all 3 of them. But again, it goes back into permitting, which Dave will talk about a little bit. But these are some ideas where you could put boardwalks, where it would make sense to put boardwalks. Thank you. And kind of what the idea of it would be. We show an elevated boardwalk that you can tell slightly higher than adjacent ground, because we elevated above where our projected sea level rise is. And then we also elevated it because we wanted to put vegetated marsh underneath it. So you need to let the light penetrate. That's also why you kind of see it up. But the idea would be that this boardwalk would kind of offer another opportunity to get out in the water, another public access piece that you don't currently have, and expand the walkable area of the park. So we'll talk about the tow protection and the reef balls kind of going forward. So the tow protection would protect that marsh. And the reason we're interested in the emergent marsh creation, it's not just for habitat. Marshes are fantastic habitat. They're breeding grounds for juvenile species. They're important for bird species and fish. But also in terms of resiliency, they dissipate wave action. So one of the big impacts from a storm event is often in the wave. Attenuation is a big piece of that. So you don't want your waves coming full force against your structures like the restroom or your boardwalk or whatever it is. When it hits the marsh, it actually dissipates the wave elevation, so you reduce your flood impacts. You still get flooded, but you actually don't have as much damage because those waves are decreased. That's also why we show marsh. It's not just because it's great, it's because it actually serves a purpose. So the tow provides in-water habitat with a little bit of kind of interesting tidal pools. The other in-water habitat are also reef balls. These are kind of showed diagrammatically, but they'd be a little bit closer to shore. We just kind of pull them out so you can see them. And they come in all sorts of different sizes, but the idea with these reef balls, they offer juvenile fish a place to hide. So all the holes in the little balls give shelter for juvenile fish so they can have a chance to get bigger. And these reef balls, you can see in the picture, they're all different sizes. So they can be scaled up or down based on what fish you're looking at or what your water column is. And they also are rough, you can see that, so you actually allow attachment. Things like mollusks and sponges and marine species can attach to that structure. So it gives an opportunity also for a lot more habitat diversity. And then similarly, you can wrap piles. So the existing pier that you guys have, or any new boardwalk piles, they can actually be wrapped with concrete that's similar. And it just gives a place of attachment for marine species. In terms of the wrapping for the piles, the benefit also, you don't get marine borers, right? They can't bore into the wood, so your pile actually lasts a lot longer, which is an issue. So if you've ever seen hourglassing of piers, those are marine borers that are eating the wood. So we have a much healthier system in New York, so you're seeing a lot more pile and pier failures because the wood gets eaten down by borers because they're living longer. So there's just a lot of different things that you can do. Again, you could take any kind of piece of this, you could just wrap the piers and it would be beneficial. You could put in some reef balls and see how people like them, see the marine use. So any one of these is kind of an opportunity. We're going to kind of move to the uplands next, and we're going to talk a little bit about the fishing pier. I know this is a very popular kind of spot. The idea was to really expand that and celebrate kind of a big piece of Hudson River history with fishing, and get people actually a little bit closer to the Hudson. You know, when we were out there, we saw a lot of fishermen actually scrambling kind of down the riprap, which is not exactly safe. So the next slide shows kind of a step situation to get people a solid place to stand, a little bit closer to the water, but also could provide a little bit more protection for the upland area, and a place to sit, kind of a place to recreate. It's just a different experience altogether. And this plaza could have interpretive signage on it that talks about, you know, fishing kind of rules and regulations. It could talk about the history of the Hudson, you know, species that it can be found. So there's an opportunity here to really kind of celebrate the existing use. You can even have a fishing kind of cleaning station. There's a lot of opportunity here to draw people to kind of this corner of the park in a lot of different ways and make it a little bit more engaging and interactive. And then we're going to carry through to the kind of center of the park, the community plaza piece. So this is kind of a remnant, kind of skinny little piece of property that really ties the south to the north on this. And the idea here was to celebrate kind of where you might drop off your kids or you might pick up people. It's kind of an odd lost space. The idea was to really make it a little bit more user-friendly and connect the different pieces of the park in a very linear way. So it's very simple. We're just talking about putting in like seating benches. You can go to the next slide. And you know, some planters with it to buffer between the road that's very close and the public space to kind of create a little bit more of a nicer ambiance, if you will, between where you have a lot of traffic happening and where you have a lot of people, you know, walking on that low beach section. And again, it just ties kind of everything together. If you want to do a special community planting, it's a good place to put it because it's kind of contained, if you will. So it's a good place to be able to say, like, okay, this community group owns these planters or maintains these planters because it's very segregated. And then it also, we suggested that on the opposite side of the street along the MTA property, Metro North be able to offer additional parking for trailers. There's enough linear space there for a couple vehicles with trailers. I know in Cold Spring, they have weekend parking for basically vehicles with trailers. So there may be an opportunity there to also park a few extra boats and trailers and make that use possible, or kayaks. This is a place where kayaking is kind of a launch point. There's that opportunity there. And then we're going to flip forward. There you go. And I know this was a big piece. Right now, you kind of have the town and the village parcels, and they don't really speak to each other well in a lot of different ways. So a lot of comments that we received were really about getting a safer crossing or having a designated walkway to kind of connect these two parcels. So that if you're on one parcel, you don't feel like you can't access or shouldn't access the other side. So we looked at vehicle turning movements, and this will work basically coming down, extending the ramp curb line, coming down. You can actually swing a vehicle and trailer into the boat launch area, and just very clearly designates kind of where the ramp ends, where there's a safe crossing for people, and where the boathouse and boat activities are. Instead of having kind of lost space down at the bottom of this ramp that people I've seen people stack up three ways. I've seen people like go right into the middle of it when people are trying to cross. So this makes it a much safer crossing. And then go forward. There you go. So again, I think this last slide is really about, we heard a lot about unifying the village and the town pieces, and there's very simple things that can be done independent of this project. There's placemaking opportunities. So a lot of people liked the swings that we're showing in the upper right-hand corner, those kind of porch swings, if you will. They're very iconic. They're fantastic wherever you see them. They're very highly used. Also talking about art. There's already some art in the park, but maybe expanding that art program into something that's iconic for Ossining, that either captures the views within the park, celebrates the history. But also very simply, there's about, I think, 3 or 4 different types of benches in the whole site, in the whole project area. Just having one bench, one lighting, one type of signage to really have a vocabulary that speaks to the whole park would be helpful in just creating a sense of place. that you know that you're within this park no matter where you are within the park. That's very easy and kind of separate and very kind of one-off projects that are easy to do. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dave.
Thank you, Barbara. So I'll talk quickly about some of the permitting aspects of the project. You know, as Kim and Barbara mentioned, ultimately the permitting for this project will be, you know, a big feature of the future design and some of the requirements that sort of guide the project ultimately. And so the project team was able to meet in February of this year with New York State DEC Region 3, what we call the pre-application meeting. So it was, you know, meeting with DEC and getting their feedback on some of the design elements of the projects and of the project. So it's really, you know, useful in, you know, sort of documenting the type of information that ultimately, you know, the regulatory agencies will require to permit a project of this magnitude. And obviously a big component of that is the in-water feature. So a lot of the discussion, you know, focuses around in-water, you know, development. So it's also an opportunity, you know, for the agencies to provide, you know, initial feedback on, you know, what they think, you know, could potentially be permitted and what might be some of the permitting challenges. So it's really useful, we found over the years, to, you know, engage early with the regulatory agencies, you know, get them familiar with the project, get them their input early on to sort of avoid any last minute pitfalls during the permitting process. You know, acquiring the actual permits was not part of this project, so that will be under a future project funding. But one of the things, you know, we thought about during the permitting discussion is the idea of a phase project, and that would help both with the cost of the project and ultimately the permitting. So essentially, you know, the in-water component could be, you know, permitted separately from some of the upland stuff, which, you know, might be a little bit easier of a process in the upland areas as opposed to in-water construction. And a lot of what the discussion centered around for the in-water work was what's shown here in this table, and that's the idea of, you know, creating habitat versus what might be lost, you know, through either fill, you know, either through the sheet piles or, you know, sediment and infilling. And so really looking at that trade-off, you know, habitat versus, you know, construction impacts. And so, you know, DEC is very sensitive to, you know, adding structures into the Hudson River. And so you have to make a really strong case of the value of that construction. And so a table like this, where we can show that the project, we estimate, would create about 0.7 acres of habitat. A lot of that being, you know, sort of the low marsh areas that Barbara talked about, but also, you know, from the reef balls and the pile wraps would also create habitat. And that trade-off versus, you know, how much fill would go into the Hudson River, which we estimate right now conceptually is about 3,000, you know, cubic yards, which is not, to me, is not a great amount of fill, but to the agencies, they look at that and they really, like Barbara mentioned, would prefer a no net fill situation. But, you know, building that case for habitat versus fill will definitely be part of the next phase of the discussion. I think the other, you know, key takeaways that we heard from the agencies beyond the in-water features was a discussion about some of the over-water features like the boardwalks. The DEC felt that, you know, we would have to make a very strong case to justify those type of structures because, you know, boardwalks over water and there's shading impacts. There's a lot to consider by building those boardwalks. So we would have to, you know, make a very strong justification on why we needed them and what was the value they would bring to the project. There was also a discussion about some of the upland, you know, potential permitting challenges, and you know, potentially would have to look at, you know, doing more studies and assessments of you know, potential fill and any contamination issues on site as well would have to, and any remediation of that would have to be considered as well in the upland areas. And then the fourth point that they hit home is they would very much like to see as much ADA, public access parts of the project, so that the project would be fully accessible by all people. And so they really encourage to make sure that all of the components of the project, are ADA accessible. With that, I will turn it over to Dan, who will talk about some of the costs of the project.
Awesome. Thank you, Dave. Appreciate it. So as part of the project, we did come up with a rough order of magnitude for what we could potentially see for costs. So the first item would be further site assessment or investigation. So going through things like wetland delineation, seeing if there are wetlands in place, if there's any endangered species in the area, site surveys, items like that. So a lot of background information on the sites that you see. Would cost roughly around $500,000 for the permitting and engineering design development. So right now the design is a very high level design. There's a lot that would still need to be fleshed out. So getting it from where it stands right now to 100%, and then working with the different agencies to get it permitted, that would be around $870,000. So for the actual construction, so dealing with selecting a contractor, helping out with bids, maybe interviewing the contractors, and any potential RFIs or requests for information, any site visits, all those sort of engineering aspects that happen during construction or during the bid, that would be $458 or 400, almost $460,000. And then Barbara and Dave have both made the point of talking about in-water and upland and the different construction costs associated. So for our in-water construction costs, that would be items like the boardwalk, the sheet pile, reef balls, etc. That would be about $5.6 million. With the upland construction costs like the community plaza, boat ramp, native planting, some of those planter items that Barbara was talking about, that would be almost $900,000. So the total potential cost for this project right now with no contingency would be about $10.5 million. So now, a couple of key takeaways in looking at those numbers. Those are some very big numbers for a very, very small piece of land. The in-water elements of the proposed project are what's going to drive this overall cost. So the boardwalk alone is coming in at around $4.9 million. And part of the issue with that, Dave kind of alluded to it, is that some of the permitting aspects and making sure that those conversations are happening, that could be potentially time consuming. So we did kind of consider that there would have to be some additional time and design factors that are dealt with there. So the permitting and the actual design would be a pretty involved process. But as stated before, phasing can help with the funding and permitting. So some of the upland features, Barbara already kind of mentioned that if you did some of the plantings and maybe working on the crossing, those are items that could be done sooner and potentially for a lot less cost upfront, and you could kind of chunk the overall thing and chip away at it. So those are some of the key takeaways. And then with that, I'm going to hand it back to Kim to talk about next steps.
Awesome, thanks, Dan. Okay, so now, as we've shown here, we have a conceptual preliminary design, and we can use that as a starting point to move forward and finalize the design. And there are a bunch of different funding opportunities that we can seek to help fund the development of the design. So a couple of examples we have up here on the slide. There are several different programs within New York State. That includes the Environmental Bond Act and Climate Smart Communities. These both provide opportunities for funding different types of resiliency projects. The state also has a Brownfield Opportunity Area Program, which funds particularly brownfields and contaminated areas and projects associated with that. We also have up here the New York State Department of Transportation, and under federal funding, we also have the Federal Highway Administration. So those might be sources for different funding opportunities, particularly for the aspects of the project that are associated with improving pedestrian and traffic safety. So for example, the crosswalk improvement near the boat ramp. A couple other federal funding opportunities are the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities program, or the BRIC program. This could also provide an opportunity for funding different types of resiliency projects. Also wanted to note that one consideration is to include in Austening's hazard mitigation plan information about the risks associated with sea level rise and flooding, as well as the erosion concerns along the waterfront area. Just so that if it's noted in our hazard mitigation plan, we can potentially use that to help leverage different funding opportunities as they are available. The next slide. So now we can answer any questions if there are any. If not see any in the Q&A. I will take this opportunity to say that if there are any folks that have interest in tracking the progress of this project, to stay in touch with the town and village of Austining, as they would be the real leaders in seeking these different funding opportunities to help move the project forward. Otherwise, if there are no questions, I would just like to thank everybody for presenting and attending this presentation, and thank you to the town and village of Austining for participating and making this project successful. Also thanks to New York State DEC and to New EPIC who helped fund this project. So thank you.
Hey, thank you, everyone. Thanks, Kim.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.